I'm going to start in a somewhat unusual way. But then, look who's talking. I mean, a guy who comes dressed in white with shirt tails hanging out. Yes, I'm Bob Hopkins. That's how I roll. God's self. Oh, what I was meaning is I'm going to do some reading first. God's self is the pinnacle of human expression, a union between the humanity of flesh and bone. God's self is an amalgamation of all that we are and all that we are capable of becoming. God's self is ours by birthright. Each and every one of us came here to experience life on earth, while remembering how to live in a multidimensional state of perfect love, accessing the divine within. A God self isn't an airy-fairy state of being. It's not about suppression or an expectation of harmony in everything. A God self is not confined by duality and embraces humanity becoming less sensitive to labels such as right and wrong or negative and positive. God's self is available here and now. It includes living in one's body and knowing one's spirituality. Ego is the Latin word for I. So if a person seems to begin every sentence with I, it is sometimes a sign of a big ego. It was the psychologist Sigmund Freud, well, actually, his original translator, who put ego into the popular vocabulary. Originally, Freud used the word ego to mean the sense of self, but later expanded it to include psychic functions such as judgment, tolerance, reality testing, control, planning, defense, synthesis of information, intellectual functioning, and memory. The ego is the organizing principle upon which our thoughts and interpretations of the world around us are based. In the ego psychology model of the psyche, the id is the set of uncoordinated instinctual desires. The superego plays the critical and moralizing role, and the ego is the organized, realistic agent that mediates between the instinctual desires of the id and the critical superego. Freud compared the ego and its relationship to the id to a man on horseback. The rider must harness and direct the superior energy of his mount, and at times allow for a practical satisfaction of its urges. The ego is thus in the habit of transforming the id's will into action as if it were its own. There's not everybody that's in support of the ego. When I first joined the Interfaith Center, I was part of Dave's Course in Miracles group for 2 years. So I love and respect Helen Schuchman and her Course in Miracles, and this is how she views the ego. The ego believes that to accomplish its goal is happiness. Recognize only that the ego's goal, which you have pursued quite diligently, has merely brought you fear, and it becomes difficult to maintain that fear. That fear is happiness. Upheld by fear, this is what the ego would have you believe. You can speak from the spirit or from the ego as you choose. If you speak from spirit, you have chosen to be still and know that I am God. These words are inspired because they reflect knowledge. If you speak from the ego, you are disclaiming knowledge instead of affirming it, and thus dispiriting yourself. She isn't alone in this negative view of the ego. Eckhart Tolle wrote, because of its phantom nature, and despite elaborate defense mechanism, the ego is very vulnerable and insecure, and it sees itself as constantly under threat. A more neutral perspective, to have ego means to believe in your own strength. and to also be open to other people's views. It is to be open, not closed. That's going to seem a little bit heretical, but I'm reading from Anton LaVey from the Satanic Bible. The Satanist believes in complete gratification of his ego. Satanism, in fact, is the only religion which advocates the intensification or encouragement of the ego. Only if a person's own ego is sufficiently fulfilled can he afford to be kind and complimentary to others without robbing himself of his self-respect. We generally think of a braggart as a person with a large ego. In reality, his bragging results from a need to satisfy his impoverished ego. Also from Anton from the Satanic Bible, religionists have kept their followers in line by suppressing their egos. By making their followers feel inferior, the awesomeness of their God is ensured. Satanism encourages its members to develop a good, strong ego because it gives them the self-respect necessary for a vital existence. I hope you're able to follow most of that reading. I know it was a lot to digest in a short span of time. I'm sure if you're here and have been here before, you would prefer to live in the God self all the time if possible. Perhaps suppress that ego, but just be in the God self. I understand the feeling. I share it a good deal of the time. But you know what? I'm here. I'm alive. I'm living in the duality. I'm well aware of the oneness. I'm well aware that this is one universe, that we are spirit. And I too would like to be living in the God self absolutely as much as possible. But you know, occasionally I've thought, well, if I'm so much into God self, what am I doing here? Let me go. Let me go be one out there. I don't know. I feel much of the time like I'm here on a mission. I ran into a woman in a restaurant this morning on my way here and talked about feeling that I got my latest job like I was on a spiritual quest. It became a spiritual experience, not a career choice. You know, I just got to be honest. The ego is what keeps me here, keeps me alive, keeps me functioning. It warns of danger. It contributes to judgment. I know judgment also has a bad reputation, like because we're judging people. But the reality is we have to make discernment. We have to let the ego in to help keep us alive. As painful as it is to say, it's duality. I had a friend recently tell me that she has no ego. I thought to myself, that's ridiculous. We all have egos. If you mean by that you don't have a big ego, I get that, but come on, no ego at all? Really? So I believe the ego is here primarily to help us sort things out on this human plane and to protect us. You know, I've let my ego operate with a bit more freedom, especially since this topic came to me as a need to be discussed. But I do draw some lines for the ego. It's like it's not okay. I don't own a gun. I'll never own a gun. I will never take another life to save my own. I'm sorry, ego, there's the limit. Somebody comes at you with a gun, a knife, whatever, take me out. I'll just go be with the oneness. It's time. But most of the time I want to be here. I love looking out over these faces. I was dancing the last week or so. I just love being around people. I want to be on this plane. And the ego allows me to continue to function in this duality. So, as much as I respect what Helen has to say about the ego, being suppressed for the emergence of the God self. I have to say I owe a lot to the ego, and I found myself many times reflecting on Helen's position and thinking, it's okay, it's here, but suppress it. Hold it down, hold it down. It's part of what gives the title of a war zone. I mean, we just fight it. Just fight it all the time. Fight it. Keep it out of control. Suppress that sucker. And then not too long ago, I started hearing some things and thinking, maybe I need to respect what the ego does. Let it do its job. Let it save my life. Let it help me to make wiser decisions. Let it ride the horse and control the id. The id, my id is pretty crazy. It needs the ego to settle it down. And save my life. Keep me from making dangerous decisions. I want to be here, and I've got to accept the duality of being here. So I don't want it to be a war zone. What do I do about that? If it's not a war zone, what the heck is it? It's shared capacity in here. It's both ego and God self. So recently, very recently, I think I decided, okay, give the ego some room, give it some credit, it's done its job. Step aside, ego, it's time for the God self to take over. And a lot of what A Course in Miracles points out is the God self is more powerful. It doesn't scream as much as the ego does. It doesn't demand like the ego does, but I think it can sort of be counted upon to assume control when it needs to. And what it should do, I think, is basically say, step aside, ego, you've had your say. You need divine inspiration to come through now. Step back. I've got it from here. I think for a long time I didn't believe that God's self was that powerful. Shoot, for a long time I didn't even know it existed. I didn't feel divine. I had an experience once that got me locked up in a mental institution because I said, I am the Holy Spirit. You say that to the wrong kind of religious person and they think you're delusional. And so I'm careful about how I express it, but I do believe God's self is in here and will step forward when the time is appropriate. It doesn't have to do more than ask permission. Thanks, ego. Step aside. I got this. Which leads me to the last part of my title, which is, again, the same friend pointed out, I used to talk a lot about schizophrenia. Well, you know, a speech pathologist I worked with years and years ago told me that about 75% of our conversation is with ourselves. And that means that there's this internal dialogue going on. Now, we're a little afraid of that, and we don't want to give it a lot of credence. If people are talking aloud to themselves, we think they're a little crazy. Maybe they're schizophrenic or something. They wouldn't talk to themselves aloud if they could control their... But I'm going to tell you, I got to embrace my schizophrenia because there are two entities, two focus of consciousness living in this head. I need them to converse with each other as opposed to fight, as opposed to suppress, just acknowledge. There's two voices. And when the ego wants something, it's got its ways. And when God's self is needing to be dominant, I think it doesn't have to fight its way into control. It can just Assert that it's my time. Thanks, ego, step back. So, embrace your schizophrenia. Those two voices talking to you. They both have validity. They both have a purpose. You know, one delightful thing I've learned from the center is the idea that the Creator put us here to delight, because we do so many crazy, interesting, wonderful, loving things. We're just a mystery to ourselves, and it's like, what are we doing here? And I know there's a lot of religious faiths that suggest that there's a need to be saved. I think there's a need to embrace life. Let it all in. Amuse our Creator. That's probably what we were created for. I've come in the last few years to treasure my sense of humor above almost everything else. It's one of the reasons I love to hear Annie speak. She always speaks with humor. Anyway, embrace the schizophrenia. And the basic title, Ego Management. Manage your ego. God's self can do that. I truly do believe it's the most powerful of the two forces. It isn't going to rush to grab center stage unless it needs to be the one in control. Unless love is called for and ego can't manage it. Maybe ego's too defensive. Maybe ego feels too threatened. But I can turn within, find the God self, and know that love can spring forth. Some of you might remember this is coming close to the anniversary when I had this powerful epiphany that I could strive to love all people all the time, knowing well that I wouldn't succeed. The ego would probably step in and say, not that person. But still, it's worth the effort, and I love believing that I'm capable of it, or I should strive for it, and knowing that God's self will direct it. So, ego management, that's our task. It doesn't have to be a war zone. To do it, you're going to have to be schizophrenic and acknowledge it. And accept the duality. We got the ego for a reason. As long as we're here, it's going to serve a function. And when the time comes, we can let the God self take over, but not in this mortal coil. Anyway, that's all I've got. Thanks.